The case was a constitutional clash on the scope of executive privilege and whether a former president may invoke it when the current one has waived it. Washington. The Supreme Court on Wednesday refused a request from former President Donald J. Trump to block the release of White House records concerning the January 6 attack on the Capitol, effectively rejecting Mr. Trump's claim of executive privilege and handing a major victory to the special House committee investigating the riot. The court, with only Justice Clarence Thomas noting a dissent, let stand an appeals court ruling that Mr. Trump's desire to maintain the confidentiality of internal White House communications was outweighed by the need for a full accounting of the attack and the disruption of the certification of the 2020 electoral count. The ruling means that there is no legal obstacle to prevent the National Archives from providing hundreds of pages of White House records to the committee. In an unsigned order, the majority wrote that Mr. Trump's request for a stay while the case moved forward presented weighty issues, including whether and in what circumstances a former president may obtain a court order preventing disclosure of privileged records from his tenure in office, in the face of a determination by the incumbent president to waive the privilege. But an appeals court's ruling against Mr. Trump did not turn on those questions, the order said. Because the Court of Appeals concluded that President Trump's claims would have failed even if he were the incumbent, his status as a former president necessarily made no difference to the court's decision, the order said. It was the latest example of a case in which the Supreme Court, which includes 3 justices appointed by Mr. Trump, ruled against him and his allies on issues related to the 2020 election, because the House committee investigating the attack sought the records from the National Archives. President Biden and Mr. Trump both had the opportunity to object. Mr. Trump invoked executive privilege, a doctrine meant to protect the confidentiality of presidential communications, over some of the documents. These sweeping requests are indicative of the committee's broad investigation of a political foe, divorced from any of Congress's legislative functions, his lawyers told the justices in an emergency application. Mr. Biden took a different view in October in declining to assert executive privilege over some of the materials. Congress is examining an assault on our Constitution and democratic institutions provoked and fanned by those sworn to protect them, and the conduct under investigation extends far beyond typical deliberations concerning the proper discharge of the president's constitutional responsibilities, wrote Dana Remus, the White House counsel. She added that executive privilege should not be employed to protect information that reflects a clear and apparent effort to subvert the Constitution itself. The committee has demanded detailed records about Mr. Trump's every movement and meeting on the day of the assault. The panel's requests include material about any plans formed in the White House or other federal agencies to derail the electoral vote count by Congress. House investigators are seeking information about Mr. Trump's lack of action in calling off the mob and more details about his pressure campaign to overturn the results of an election he lost at the polls. Among the documents that Mr. Trump had asserted executive privilege over were proposed talking points for Kayleigh McEnany, his former press secretary, a handwritten note concerning January 6, a draft text of a presidential speech for the Save America rally that preceded the mob attack, and a draft executive order on the topic of election integrity, the filing states. Mr. Trump has also sought to block the release of records from the files of Mark Meadows, his former chief of staff, Stephen Miller, his former senior advisor, and Patrick F. Philbin, his former deputy counsel. Mr. Trump also sought to stop the release of the White House Daily Diary, a record of the president's movements, phone calls, trips, briefings, meetings and activities, as well as logs showing phone calls to the president and to Vice President Mike Pence concerning January 6. Finally, Mr. Trump tried to keep secret a draft proclamation honoring the Capitol Police and 2 officers who died after the riot, Brian D. Sitnick and Howard Liebengood. as well as related emails, a memo about a potential lawsuit against several states that Mr. Biden won, an email chain from a state official regarding election-related issues, and talking points on supposed election irregularities in one county in Michigan. Mr. Trump told the justices that he had a constitutional right to shield the materials from Congress even though Mr. Biden declined to invoke executive privilege over them. The disagreement between an incumbent president and his predecessor from a rival political party, Mr. Trump's lawyers told the court, is both novel and highlights the importance of executive privilege and the ability of presidents and their advisors to reliably make and receive full and frank advice, without concern that communications will be publicly released to meet a political objective. Lawyers for the House committee responded that the Supreme Court should not thwart its inquiry. The Select Committee's work, they wrote, is of the highest importance and urgency. Investigating one of the darkest episodes in our nation's history, a deadly assault on the United States Capitol and Congress, and an unprecedented disruption of the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next. Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh, who served as staff secretary to President George W. Bush, was the only justice to issue a signed opinion in the case. He said the appeals court, in a passage the majority had said was non-binding, had been wrong in its analysis. A former president must be able to successfully invoke the presidential communications privilege for communications that occurred during his presidency, even if the current president does not support the privilege claim, Justice Kavanaugh wrote. Concluding otherwise would eviscerate the executive privilege for presidential communications. Mr. Trump had sued to block release of the documents, saying that the committee was investigating possible criminal conduct, a line of inquiry that he said was improper, and that the panel had no valid legislative reason to seek the requested information.